Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have you here today for the Building Best-in-Class Dashboards and Data Studio webinar. We are going to just wait a few extra minutes before Dan kicks off the presentation to allow a few last-minute registrants to sign in to GoToWebinar. So if you don't mind just waiting a few extra minutes, we will be getting started shortly. Thanks so much. All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining. Dan is going to be beginning the presentation here shortly on building best-in-class dashboards in Data Studio. So my name is Chase Howell. I am the marketing manager here at InfoTrust. I just want to go through a few housekeeping items and tell you a little bit about InfoTrust before we kick things off. So the question that definitely will come up, I'm sure, multiple times throughout the presentation still, yes, we are recording this webinar, and we will be sending out the recording along with the deck afterwards. You can expect to receive that from our team here within the next week. We have left time for Q&A at the end of Dan's presentation. There's a handy dandy questions chat panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. So feel free to submit your questions to Dan in that control panel throughout the presentation. And then lastly, if you want to contact Dan after he finishes today's presentation on building dashboards in Data Studio, we will provide his contact information for you. So a little bit about InfoTrust. InfoTrust is an independent digital analytics consultancy. We are based in Cincinnati. We actually have offices in Chicago, Barcelona, and Dubai. Dan is actually based in our Chicago office, so he will be coming to you from the Windy City today. And then a little bit more about Dan. Dan is a lead analytics consultant here at InfoTrust. He has 10 years of experience on building dashboards for enterprise level clients. He's actually the Digital Analytics Association Chicago chapter leader. So he's very involved in the analytics community. and he is a Fighting Irish Notre Dame graduate. So somewhat sad about the result that the Fighting Irish got against Georgia this past weekend, but he's looking for a rebound there. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dan Vivaldelli, and he is going to kick off the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chase, and welcome everybody. I'm so excited to share this content with you today. So just looking at our agenda for the next hour, we'll be looking at the qualities of an effective dashboard. We'll also be touching on how to build an effective dashboard. And then the last part of the session is actually going to be a working session where we'll probably spend 10 to 15 minutes actually going through a live dashboard and applying some of the principles that we'll be talking about today. So to kick things off, I typically like to just define what a dashboard is. And for those that are more active and familiar with the data visualization community, I think Edward Tufte and Stephen Few are two notable people in the industry that have a lot of great perspective and have written some really great books. But to start off here with a definition from Edward, statistical graphics consisting of complex ideas communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency. And Stephen defines it as a dashboard as a visual display of the most important information needed to achieve one or more objectives that has been consolidated on a single screen so it can be monitored at a glance. Two really great definitions, I think, of what a dashboard is. And I think they kind of highlight some of the pain points that I see when I work with clients in building dashboards. And lastly, on the right-hand side, you can see you've got a comic here. And we know there are some folks in the room when we're designing dashboards that want to add as much content as possible, possibly even fuzzy dice. So to kick things off, it's easy to talk about some of the definitions and the rules about what makes a good dashboard, but I find that oftentimes folks just know a good dashboard when they see one. So looking at the dashboards on the left and the right, I'm going to launch a poll here. And unfortunately, I can only do one or the other. I can show you the dashboards or I can launch the poll. So take a quick glance here while I launch the poll for everybody. And I'm really curious just to see which one everybody thinks is a more effective dashboard. And I'll give everybody a minute here just to respond. Okay, so the numbers are coming in. So far, 94% thought that the dashboard on the left was more effective, and 6% really need this webinar. So. There we go. Okay, final numbers. But really, I think it's helpful to also define what, in my experience, makes an effective dashboard. So a couple of things. Views have a specific stated objective or set of objectives. It's hard to build something that's really great if you don't know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Another common problem or something to watch out for is that the data is well organized and actionable. And that highlights meaningful relationships. Oftentimes I've seen folks just stuff charts and tables in wherever they feel like and trying to occupy maybe some empty space, and that becomes your dashboard. And then lastly, is just making sure that your dashboard is summarized to the appropriate level for the intended audience. Typically this falls into an executive view, which is more of a summary view and a highlight for folks, or maybe more detailed view for individual stakeholders to hop into the numbers. So going back to the dashboard on the right-hand side and thinking about our definition of what makes an effective dashboard. So here, I think there's a lot going on. At the top left-hand corner, we can see we've got weather stations, all kinds of weather metrics, going down to the middle row where we've got information about the status of the tube, all kinds of commuting information. We threw in some air pollution here. There's even a camera view that you can watch the streets. A wonderful new sticker here, and even some Twitter hashtags for what's trending in London. So this dashboard really covers a lot. I don't know the specific objective. I would wager to say that there probably was none. And the organization of the data itself, I think, is a little confusing, just how things are lined up and how they're put together. For instance, the fact that we've got some of this commuting information along with the air pollution, it just doesn't really kind of flow for me. And then really, I think summarized data is an issue here where there's not a lot that's actually being summarized. It's really just kind of puking up a bunch of data and putting it in a dashboard for folks. So there's a lot of opportunity. I don't like to say that there's really terrible dashboards. Certainly some people would say that, but I think there's just a lot of opportunity to make this dashboard better and more usable for folks. So when we think about building a dashboard, I tend to break it into two chunks, and it's what you do before you build that dashboard, and then it's what you do as you're building the dashboard. So looking at the pre-build process, like I said earlier, you want to state the purpose of your view. You want to document all of your business questions. Typically those come from individual stakeholders who will be actually using the dashboards themselves. You want to define your KPIs, metrics, and dimensions. And lastly, you want to create wireframes. So you really have something that you're working towards as you're building the live version of that dashboard. So when we're talking about documenting objectives, here's the way that I typically lay it out, and just have everything in one sheet in one single view. So it's really easy to draw the connections here about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So here we have a very clearly defined summary. This is a leading view in the dashboard, which will allow report consumers to quickly understand business performance across key metrics and financial objectives. And when we think about those key metrics and financial objectives, we have that down here. So I've gone through the process of defining KPIs. Obviously, this has been sanitized a little bit from my own work, but we've documented the KPIs from talking to our stakeholders. And then, to draw a distinction between KPIs and all the other reporting, I think it's helpful to split out what other dimensions and what other metrics that you're going to include in your dashboard. Not everything is a KPI, because if it were, then everything would be important, and that's not what a KPI is. And so making that distinction between the KPIs and then the actual reporting, it's fine to have additional metrics, it's fine to have additional dimensions, but to draw that delineation makes it a lot easier when you're actually putting together and prioritizing your dashboard pieces to put all that together. And then some of the guiding questions that we have here for our business questions help us piece together what elements are really important and that this dashboard really needs to answer in a prioritized way for the stakeholders. So what was the financial forecast and the reporting month, and was it achieved? Did a specific brand under or overperform to financial forecast? These are the kinds of things that often live in people's heads, but don't always make it out. And when you're working across the team of stakeholders that are going to be using the dashboards, if it's in their heads, it does little value to bring that into the dashboard until you document it, summarize it, and use that to build your dashboard. Moving on to creating wireframes. So you can see here I've laid things out really just in a way that allows you to answer some of the business questions and to achieve those the key objectives. And so we've got KPIs at the top. They're big, they're noticeable. They're the first thing that you'll see when you open this dashboard. One of the other questions was about viewing metrics by brand. So we can see here we've got maybe some of the KPIs with a brand view for them, and then lastly some trends and a summary table for folks to look at. So typically this is a format that brings people in. It's very visual. There's a lot of visual elements, and pretty quickly you can see you can start answering your business questions as soon as you load this dashboard. Another common question that I get is just how you use the different chart elements when you're building a dashboard, and what's really appropriate when you're doing so. So if you're looking to compare values, a bar, a pie, or a donut graph, I think are pretty helpful. So what we're looking at here is showing values of several items at a single point in time. So you can really easily prioritize those values and see what's floating to the top and what's not. Showing composition, so understanding single value and reference to others in a point in time. We've got a waterfall or a bullet graph, that's my go-to. Analyzing trends, so obviously just looking at data over a certain period of time, using line, column, area. Spark lines are things that I really love incorporating because they're small little graphs that you can fit, and I'll just go back here for a second. So this is an instance of a spark line if you're not familiar with it. So not only do you get a sense of the metric, the actual number that you're reporting, and then whether you're up or down compared to the reporting period, you can also see the trend of that data in the spark line. And then showing relationships, typically my go-to are scatter plots or bubble charts. All right, and so when we're looking at actually building a dashboard, I think that this typically comes down to effectively prioritizing the data that's in your dashboard, and then maximizing the data to ink ratio is how I approach it. And so a really great example of why visualization is so important. We know from research that's been done that humans are much better at processing data when it's visualized. It saves time, and it typically increases memory recall. And so the data set on the left-hand side is an example of this, where we have incomes quartet. And if you were actually to summarize the metrics here for the data set, if we're looking at mean, variance, correlation coefficients, and the line of best fit, all of them are the same. And you can actually see a lot of the X values are similar here, and so are the Y. So, we're thinking about really large data sets. It's not obvious that these are very different. And in fact, from your summary statistics, you would think that they are the same. But when you actually graph them out here, you can see that they have very different curvatures and outliers that lead to the summary metrics. But when you graph it, you can see clear differences in the data here. And especially when you're trying to consume a lot of data all at once, this is how you want to approach it. Speaking of prioritizing data within your dashboard, most folks tend to read dashboards in a Z pattern. So starting in the top quadrant over here, going to the right, going down to the left, and then going over to the right. Research has shown it's just because that's the way we tend to read books and text. And so because we have that in our minds, that's just kind of the go-to of how we tend to read information and dashboards and content. So you can see I've broken this dashboard into 4 quadrants, with the most important being the top left. And we can see that obviously going over to the right, this is a key block, but really your least important block is going to be down in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, I'm not saying that nobody's going to look at it, but it's not going to be the first place that people look. So when you go back to your business questions, when you go back to the key objectives for a dashboard, this is how I tend to prioritize my data and lay things out on a dashboard using this methodology. And so speaking of which, if we go back to that earlier example of the wireframe, we can see along the top, this is exactly why I included my KPIs. here at the top row. So if you read this in the Z pattern, starting in the top left-hand corner, we have all of our KPIs, and we know exactly how we're doing as we scan across them, and we can see the trend of them, like I noted in the spark lines. Starting down in the bottom left-hand corner, if we go across, then we answer some of those other key business questions about the brand. And then we have our trend in the bottom left-hand corner as well. And then a little bit more data detail in the bottom right-hand side. Because it's a little bit harder for folks to process that, I tend to put that, I tend to deprioritize tables and full data sets if you're including them. So. Thinking about refining the dashboard, I was talking about maximizing your data to ink ratio, and oftentimes folks are a little unfamiliar with what that actually is. So every Tufty has a definition here, but put simply, there's ink on your dashboard or pixels that are for data, and then there's everything else. And so the everything else is what you want to minimize. And then the data and the visual representation of that data is what you really want to maximize. This is really a minimalist approach to dashboarding, which is the camp that I fall in. I tend to find less distracting visual elements to make it easier to focus on the data. And so that's what I strive for when I refine my dashboards. So to visually illustrate this, I've got a graph here and then a table. And so when we look at the data to ink ratio, I think it's pretty obvious, like what is our data? So it's our numbers, it's the classification of the months for the data, and all the extra things like lines and borders, and even the highlighting in the background of this table really doesn't add anything to the visualization. And this is where it kind of gets to be a little bit subjective. So my advice is to really just pay attention to your data to ink ratio and refine it as much as possible, understanding that you're not going to take every element that's not data related out of a chart, and I wouldn't recommend that. And I realize that there are varying degrees of taste of what you need and opinions about what you need in a dashboard. But it's really just something to be mindful of and a great way to optimize your dashboard. All right, so for the next poll here, I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes, or just a minute here, to go through and just count the number of threes that you see in this visualization. All right, I hope you got it, but I'm going to launch a poll here, and I want to see where folks net out here. Awesome. Okay. So looks like we had a number of folks that were able to actually count this, but a couple folks had trouble, and that's for a very good reason, and that's because of pre-attentive processing. So pre-attentive processing is the notion of what your subconscious is actually doing for you in the background to help you understand what's going on, and then the actual thoughts start occurring. So when we draw the threes out here in the visualization, it's a lot easier to see them. And really, you don't have to do any mental work well, you have to do a lot less mental work to do the counting. You still have to count. But you don't have to sort through each number and think about what they are and then add them and make the decision of whether is or is not a three. This is, I think, something that's really crucial in dashboarding. For the fact that the more that you have to work to arrive at an answer, the more that you have to look at something to understand what's happening, that's wasted mental energy on things that you could be actually doing analysis for. So as much as you can, you want to highlight those insights for folks by paying attention to your pre-intensive attributes and downplaying the things that that are not important. So there's less mental work to do when you're working on your dashboard. So a couple of things that are important to pay attention to are your color, both the hue and the intensity. So obviously darker or higher saturated colors are perceived to be more important. And I know this is small, but you can see this guy really stands out really easily. Same thing for size. Here I am automatically goes to this big data point right here. And then when we look at lines, you know, for some reason, you know, we've got this thick blue one, we have a slightly less thick red one, and then an orange one, and then some lines that are in the background. I would interpret these to say that the thicker ones are more important, and then the lighter ones just kind of follow the background, and you hardly really notice them. Another one is enclosure, and so just being mindful of the borders and colors that you use to draw your visualizations. So here's a table. So you know, we're separating the title with the color. We've got gray and then white, and then we've got lines between the two. Honestly, there's only so much that you need here, right? So we're trying to draw the distinction between the different lines in this table. And really, lines will do it, shading will do it, but you don't really need both. And then lastly are marks. And so these tend to be things like up or down arrows that you'll see that tell you whether you're doing good or bad. You could also put in something that signifies when something of an alarm. So when something has reached a threshold, or maybe you've achieved a goal, but just an extra visual element to call your attention to something within the dashboard. And lastly, some of the common things that I will typically eliminate when I'm working with a dashboard that really don't impact the data are additional shading and graphs, icons, and tables. So things like the shading around the edges are really not necessary. And again, when you think back to the mental work that it takes to, okay, I see a table, I see the shading, am I paying attention to the shading, am I paying attention to the numbers? Those are things you want to be mindful of. Also grid lines, custom backgrounds. This is a big one that I see in the industry. They look nice, but they are oftentimes distracting unless they're a little bit more subdued. And then color gradients often don't add business value, but look pretty. So with that, I have prepared an example dashboard that we can walk through and start actually applying some of these principles and actually refine a little bit. So this is a live dashboard that I actually pulled from Google's visualization gallery. So I apologize if anybody on the line actually made this, but you know, here we are. So when I'm looking at this dashboard, let me make my screen just a little bit bigger to make it easier to walk through this. Let's get some more real estate here. So, I mean, the first thing that stands out to me is really the format of this dashboard. This is one really long page. And so this is something that I tend to refrain from doing, is creating a really long dashboard. The reason being is that, you know, if you're familiar with scroll rates on web pages, very few people make it down to the very bottom. And the same thing is true for your dashboard. So unless there is something that's really important down at the bottom for folks that they're compelled to scroll to the bottom for, by and large, most people will probably stick to the top and hope that the important things are at the top and probably not look down at what's at the bottom. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is just start out by splitting this dashboard up. So I'm going to duplicate this page. And if we go back to the first page, I think there's kind of a clear delineation here. We have overview metrics, and then we have conversion metrics that kind of relate back to the overview. But down at the bottom, we get into the audience and acquisition and behavior portion of the dashboard. This feels like a clear delineation to me. So I'm actually going to split it here and just remove these elements in our dashboard. And then the way they've achieved this view, it's not a standard canvas size, is to adjust the height here. So I'm going to set that at 1,000, and I think that, yeah, that's about right. Okay. And so between our 2 pages, and let me actually rename these here to overview. And we'll call this audience. Go ahead and get rid of that guy. I am going to clear out all of the overview tables here. Okay, and then just shift all these up. Okay, much better. All right, so going back to our first page. There's a couple of things that stand out to me on the first page here. So, I mean, if we're scanning this dashboard from left to right and going down, the first thing that draws my eye are the numbers here. And so one thing that is kind of a pet peeve for me is the summarization of numbers. So really, how much detail is really important in these numbers? And so I tend to use compact numbers in my visualizations. For the bounce rate, again, I don't really think that we need 2 decimal places here. Set to auto, so I'm just going to set that to 1. Same thing for conversion rate, going to set that to 1. And then our revenue. So this is a big one that happens all the time, is adding in cents. So let's just make this a compact number, and really, we'll just set it at 2, because that seems pretty good right now. Looking at this chart here, you know, it's kind of hard to see, and honestly, something that I see across here are just the different uses of color. And if we think about the use of color in our dashboards, we can see like what really draws your attention. But I tend to use neutral colors in my visualizations because they have a calming effect, as opposed to when you use red and when you use orange. So I'm going to just change this line here to be blue. And I'm going to adjust my thickness because I think it's a little bit difficult to see. And I'm going to set that to 4. And then we're calling out that this is sessions, the website sessions trend. I don't really think that anybody's confused about what we're graphing here. So I'm going to remove the legend there. And just to be a little bit more consistent in the background, I'm going to set it to white to clean this up a bit. There we go. And then I think what's really helpful and what's missing from this is a comparison. So we don't know if this is good or bad. So I'm going to drop in a previous year comparison. So we can actually see how we're trending year over year. And just like I called out before, looking at this metric here, I think this is another opportunity to summarize. So let's just set that to a compact number. And then we have a metric here for goal data, but no actual data. So I'm actually going to get rid of this. This is a really important thing when you're working with dashboards. If you don't have the data, don't include it in the dashboard until it's available. It tends to confuse stakeholders as to why it's there, and it just takes up real estate. It's more to look at. So same thing for this graph here. So I'm going to adjust my line color to blue, set our thickness to 4 so it's easy to read. Again, we're calling out that these are the website goal trends. So we really don't need to have that legend there. And then I'm going to set our background. And it's looking much better. I think we can also add in a comparison here. So we'll just add in previous year. All right, and then this table here, again, we've got the coloring at the top. I'm not sure that it's even really necessary. You could do white and then set your text to black, and you still have an idea of what's going on here. One of the things that I struggle with the metrics they've included, we've got goal completions and then goal value. So goal value, we know we don't have any data for. And so maybe a next logical thing might be sessions to include here. But still, what you want to get a sense of is how these source and medium groupings are actually leading to completions and which ones are doing better. So I think a better metric actually is a goal conversion rate. So I'm going to drop this in. So we have a little bit better context. So we can see here what are the top performers in terms of total goal completions, but relative to the traffic, we can see what really stands out. So this is a lot easier, gives a little bit more context to read what's going on. And I'm going to slide this over so we can actually see what our conversion rate is here. There we go. Much nicer. And then looking at the bottom, this is really just kind of the same stuff, so I'll update it real quick here. We'll set our color to blue, our thickness to 4. We've already got the, we already have the year-over-year comparison, so I think that's great. But looking at this table as well, it's really confusing as to how this was sorted. And I think this was a data error on whoever designed it. So first I'm going to set my table color to white and our text to black so we know what we're looking at. But when we actually look at what's being sorted here, it's the goal value, which we know we have no data for. So this is really misleading in terms of top selling products. So I'm actually going to just add in unique purchases here to sort by and clean this up. Awesome. I think this looks 100% better than how we found it. And again, you know, what calls your attention here are the colors and the metrics at the top. I'm assuming these are KPIs. The trends, you still get a sense of what's going on in the trends, but there's none of the funky colors that would make you think that maybe something is wrong. And then my eye is not really drawn to the bright colors in the tables. And we've got our sorting down in our table. So much better here. Let's take a look at our second page. Okay, so something that's really important to pay attention to. I mean, when you just scan over this, we can see all the different colors that were used. And stats down here, we've got stoplight colors for heat mapping. So that's really not helpful. It makes you think that something is good or bad in this table that we're not really sure of. And outside of color, I mean, we have to just look at the sessions by gender. So we can see that we've got our bubble chart or scatter chart here being used, and it's kind of an effective use of the scatter chart, but really I think that we could just use a donut and achieve the same thing. Again, with the colors here, we don't really want to call out with bold colors what's like the individual genders here. So I'm actually going to use more neutral colors in no particular order. I'm just going to choose 2 gradients of blue, so that you just get a sense of the differences here in the delineations. And what I do like about this is that we've got the numbers included here. One thing that I often struggle with pie charts or donut charts is the use of as just the slices. When you don't know what the numbers actually are, this would be really hard to believe, or sorry, not believe, but to read if you didn't know what the numbers were. So I always like to add that in. And again, for our sessions by device, I'm going to just update the colors here to be a gradient. That's a little bit easier to read. Maybe make the last one a little bit lighter, so it's really different from that middle color. But that's a nice device breakdown. One other thing to watch out for in your charts is when you have data that's not present. And so as the very top item here, the thing that's getting the most sessions is our not set. So what we actually want to do is add a filter to it to clean that up. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, looking much better. Again, these colors down at the bottom here are a little crazy. So let's just update our metrics here. So here we can see got our column 1, and then here's our heat map for red. And if a heat map is really important, I will just use a more neutral color like gray, just to make sure we're being consistent here. There we go. So it does add that context to the heat map, but it doesn't immediately scream at you that something's wrong. Same thing for the colors here. So let's just update that red because that's now what we're looking at. That's really the first thing that stands out. And then we'll also update this heat map. Cool. And again, looking at like empty data that's in your dashboard and things that you want to avoid, down at the bottom here, we can see that we've got one search term that's being used in the reporting period. I'm assuming there's probably something wrong with the search terms. So honestly, when data is really low like this, it's something that you can speak to with your stakeholders and let them know that you're going to monitor, but just take it out because it's really not adding any value. And it's taking up valuable real estate here in our dashboard. So let's move this guy over. We'll recenter everything. And that makes like much more room for us to add in other metrics or other KPIs if that was something that we wanted. We're also working with page title data here, which tends to be a little unwieldy because the titles are so long. So let's just shorten this up a little bit. Perfect. And then the other thing is we have the numbers on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side, it's really consistent. And because we're really only working with 7 rows of data here, I would actually just remove those row numbers to make some more real estate for your dashboard. And again, we can go through and then just update the different titles here in our text. Perfect. Okay. So really, I mean, this covers a lot of the principles that we had in the dashboard slides. Sorry, in the slides that we covered. Some of the pre-attentive processing, some of the prioritizing, and really just a number of things. So looks like we've got a question here. So there's a question about heat map thresholds and if you can define those. And so no, you cannot define them. It's really just relative to that particular data set that you're looking at. And so it's going to call out the things that are at the top. of that data set, but you can't define the heat maps per se. So good question. That's from Mario. Cool. Anything else as we're looking at Data Studio and looking at this completed view that folks have questions on? I'm happy to just pause here for a minute and answer any questions specific to this. Awesome. Okay. Well, great. So with that, we can just open it up to Q&A for the last 15 minutes here and see if folks have any questions. Or honestly, I'm also really interested to see what your pain points are, maybe at your organization, or what your experience is with building dashboards within your organization. Cool. Okay, so I've gotten one question from Adley about defining KPIs. And so that's a process that you want to go through, obviously, as you're building your dashboard. And the question is around, like, how do you do it? So when I work with individual stakeholders, obviously you want to gather everybody into the room that's going to be consuming the data and working with the dashboard, and ask them really a series of questions to get at the heart of what they want for the reporting. So things like, what are their goals? What are important to them? What reporting do they wish they had? And then what do they want, but do they trust the data? I think those are big topics that you want to dive into. And through that process and through what you hear back from stakeholders, that's a good opportunity to really align the organization. And again, then map out your KPIs. And through that process, you'll also probably come up with some key business questions, and along with some of the additional reporting that folks will want to see. So that's a good opportunity to document and share it back with everybody, and make sure that everybody in the org is in alignment, so that you can build really just the most effective dashboard for your stakeholders. Let's see, we've got one more question here. So the question is, does InfoTrust leverage Google Data Studio for all of your client needs, or do you use other enterprise software such as Power BI or Tableau? What is your point of view on the difference between softwares? So great question. Actually, we are agnostic to the platform at InfoTrust. And so we'll work with whichever platform clients have their data in, and whatever dashboarding software they have invested in as an organization. It doesn't really make sense if you've invested a lot of time to build out your data sets and build out your reporting within one platform, then to just move it over to another platform, unless there's a really huge business value that you're going to gain in doing so. And I think that most folks in the industry would probably agree that Tableau is the clear leader in dashboarding software. It's been around for the longest, and has a lot of functionality built into it. And there's a lot of things that you can do within Tableau that are just more challenging within Google Data Studio or Power BI. And my experience with Power BI is that it tends to be a little bit more complex to arrive at the dashboarding, just given the structure of the data that you're working with and how you're trying to summarize things within the tool, has been my experience. And so honestly, a lot of folks, if you haven't invested already as an organization in the platform, or if you're not happy with the platform that you got, oftentimes Google Data Studio is a great platform for those folks, just because of it's so simple to use, and it's also free. So, and as well, along with that, the backend ETL process of getting your data in there looks very similar. And a lot of our clients use BigQuery to get the data in, and then pipe it into Google Data Studio for visualization. So That's really a great approach and something that we leverage for a number of clients. Great. Okay. Well, this is our last slide. I think we've answered all of the questions. Again, thank you all for joining today. And just a heads up, our next webinar is going to be October 16th on why customer data governance is the foundation of your in-house strategy, led by Kent Oldham. So with that, Chase, any closing things that you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you learned something about dashboards and Data Studio. If you ever would like to discuss dashboards one-on-one with Dan or another member of the InfoTrust team, visit our site, infotrust.com, and there is a handy dandy contact form there. So thank you everyone.
Yep, thanks so much. Have a good one.